Welcome to the Door Roller Money Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Berger. Today in episode 341, we're going to be talking about rebalancing an investment portfolio. What it is, why you should do it, how you should do it, how you should maybe not do it. And this comes from a question I received in the Facebook group. By the way, if you're not a member of the Facebook group, you can join doorroller.net/Facebook group. We'd love to have you. And this question comes from JC, and I'm going to just read it literally, what he wrote in the comment. He says, rebalancing via guardrails versus annual rebalancing. I prefer using plus or minus 5 points to trigger rebalancing. So that's kind of a question. Well, it was in response to a call for questions I put out in the Facebook group and got a ton of responses, working through them. Should be done with all the questions, I think, by 2023. We'll see. But they're great questions. And rebalancing just happens to be something I've been very focused on in my own research, which I'm sort of constantly doing. A lot of it's been around retirement investing and spending. And by that, I mean investing while you're actually in retirement, which, having now started to experience that a little bit, it's a totally different world. And as part of that analysis, I've been looking at rebalancing. How does that affect the 4% rule? When should you rebalance? And all these sorts of questions. So got a number of important things I want to get through today in today's show. And so let's get started. And the first question I think we need to answer is sort of, what is rebalancing and why should we even bother? And so the idea behind rebalancing is, imagine if we have a portfolio that's 80% stocks, 20% bonds. We'll just keep it simple for the moment. And that's the portfolio you've decided is best for you. It could be anything, but we'll just use 80-20. And of course, the stock and bond market moves. It does well, it does poorly, whatever. And in a matter of days, weeks, months, years, all of a sudden your portfolio is no longer 80-20. It's 85-15 or it's 75-25. It's moved as the markets have moved. The idea of rebalancing is to buy and sell investments. Usually, I think for most listeners of this show, it's going to be buying and selling index funds. Some of you may have complicated your portfolio like I have by buying individual stocks. Maybe that's a whole nother show. How do you factor all of that into a rebalancing? In any event, we're going to keep it simple for today's show. It's a matter of buying and selling index funds or whatever your investments are, to bring your portfolio back in line with your original plan, in our example, 80-20, right? Now, okay, that's what it is, but why would we do that? And there are really two reasons. The first is to maintain the risk profile that you set for yourself. So when you picked 80-20, I'm going to assume you did it for a reason. Now, it may not have been purely based on some mathematical formula. I think we all know that asset allocation, at least in my view, is as much art as it is science. At some point, it's just, well, I got to pick something. And there are certainly wrong answers to the question, what should your asset allocation be? But I think there's a lot of right answers, reasonable answers. Maybe that's a better way to put it. But you picked it for some reason. And you probably, if you picked 80-20 or 90-10 or 70-30, you were probably uncomfortable with a 100% stock portfolio because of the volatility that you'll experience. They call that risk. I tend to prefer volatility because there are all kinds of risks in investing. Volatility is not the only one. And one might even argue that volatility is not the most important one. But in any event, volatility does concern folks. We don't like to see it when our portfolios drop, right, by a lot. And so you probably picked it so that the bonds in your portfolio could give you some stability. And by the way, even if you're 100% in stocks, you probably don't have them all in an S&P 500. You probably have international stocks, maybe emerging markets, maybe some REITs, maybe some small caps. So you might be looking at rebalancing within those, I'll call them sub-asset classes. We'll talk about that in a minute. But keeping it at a high level, you picked your stock bond allocation for a reason, usually to maintain some level of stability in the portfolio. And so the first reason you rebalance is to get back to that original plan so you can keep that original risk profile, if you will, that you decided on to begin with. Now, will that actually increase your returns in the long term? Well, in some cases, yes. In some cases, no. It depends what you're rebalancing from. If stocks have dropped, maybe we hit a bear market like earlier this year and bonds have gone up, so your 80-20 is now let's say 70-30, and you rebalance back to 80-20, that's likely going to increase your returns over the long term. That's at least true if over the long term stocks outperform bonds like they historically have. On the other hand, maybe we've had a recent run up in the stock market. So maybe your 80-20 portfolio is now 85-15 and you rebalance back to 80-20. That's likely going to reduce your long-term returns because you're reducing the percentage of stocks you have in your portfolio. And again, someone may say, well, boy, that seems silly. Why would we do that? And the answer to that question is, well, why did you start with an 80-20 portfolio to begin with, right? Well, again, it gets back to a certain risk profile that you were comfortable with. And unless that's changed, you want to stick with that risk profile that you're comfortable with. And so you rebalance back to it. And yes, if that means reducing the stocks in your portfolio because maybe the market's gone up quickly and significantly in stocks, you'll get back to your risk profile. But sure, it probably will lower your returns in the long term. Maybe not by a lot, but we all know that every bit counts. But again, it gets you back to the original decision and plan that you made when you set your portfolio allocation to begin with. Now, that's the first reason. There is a second reason. It actually involves increasing returns. And how does that work? Well, I mentioned sub-asset classes. So your portfolio on the stock side might be, if it's like mine, for example, I have 10% in REITs, I have 10% in small cap, 10% in emerging markets. Then I have larger percentages in U.S. stocks, and that can fluctuate between an S&P 500 and a total market fund, mainly for tax reasons, but it can fluctuate between one of those. And then I have a developed market or international fund. And so they have different percentages. And those can, of course, vary over time. And so there's a concept called opportunistic rebalancing. And the idea is, let's say emerging markets does really poorly over the course of a year. And so my 10% allocation is now, I'll just make up a number, 7%. Well, rebalancing back into that 10% number, in my case, in this example, 10% allocation, effectively allows me to buy quote unquote low, right? When emerging markets are beat up and down. Now, what am I selling to get to that? Well, I'm selling whatever sub-asset class in my stock portfolio has gone up. So maybe REITs have been on fire. And just to make the math work, they're at 13%. And so I can sell high, right? I can sell 3% of my REIT fund and put it into emerging markets, which is low. So I buy low. And studies have shown that over time, opportunistic rebalancing can improve the returns of a portfolio. And you do it while at the same time maintaining your original risk profile, right? We're not extending the risk of our portfolio by increasing our stock allocation. We're just getting back to what we planned originally. But it effectively allows us to sell high and buy low. Now, I will say the studies that I've read, the increases in the returns to the portfolio are not like astronomical. It's not like it takes an expected return of 9% and turns it into 13. We're talking maybe 30, 40 basis points. But it's not that hard of work to do to rebalance a portfolio. And, excuse me, and I'll take the 30 or 40 basis points. Of course, that's based on backtesting. What the future holds, we don't know. But I think conceptually it makes a lot of sense to do this. Again, it kind of bakes into the process a sell high, buy low mentality, which I think is smart. And at the same time, it gets you back to your original allocation. So it makes all kinds of sense. Now, that's sort of the why behind rebalancing. Now, before we get into the two basic approaches, some things to keep in mind. Whatever approach you take, I think it's important that it be objective, right? And the reason is you want to take your emotions out of the equation. When the market's just going sky high and you think, I'm just going to ride it a little bit longer before I rebalance, that's I call it the monkey brain. That's your monkey brain talking, or my monkey brain talking. That's not the rational, reasonable approach, I think, to investing. Now, some will say, but isn't there something behind momentum? There is actually, yes. And we can take advantage of that in the way that we rebalance, which I'll explain in a minute. But that still doesn't mean we have to remove the objective criteria that we'll use that triggers rebalancing. We can still have objective criteria in our approach and still take advantage of the natural sort of momentums of the market without letting our emotions take over. All right, so that's sort of the first thing. The second thing is, just like asset allocation, in my view, there's no one right answer. There's no one right approach to rebalancing. You'll find articles, and I'm going to mention one in a minute, that do some back testing. I think, that's important. You should consider it. But, back testing can only tell us so much. And so I don't think there's, don't look for the holy grail here. A good rebalancing approach is good enough. That's what we want, right? And I kind of alluded to this already, but don't fall in love with back testing. I think that's true when you come up with your asset allocation plan. I've been reading a lot of books on how much money you can spend each year in retirement without going broke, right? And of course, the 4% rule, but if you've studied it at all, you know that the 4% is actually just the beginning. It's the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more nuance and interesting analysis that should go into this. And I've actually started a series on my YouTube channel on the 4% rule. It's much more nuanced than just, we'll start with 4%. In fact, I don't think any retiree actually follows the 4% rule. But in any event, you can see these authors who come up with these elaborate asset allocations. We're going to do 4.5% here and 7% here, and I've back tested it to 1926, and it's like, yeah, but we have no idea if that's what the future holds. So don't fall in love with back testing. It's a point, it's a piece of evidence, noted, but take it with a grain of salt. All right. Having said all of that, let's get to the two approaches. The easiest approach is simply time-based. So you could say, okay, once a year I'm going to rebalance, or once a quarter, once every 6 months. I've even seen some suggest once every 2 years. But it's going to be purely time-based. Now, it's easy to apply. It's kind of like every time the time changes and you change the batteries in your smoke detector, you rebalance your portfolio. Or every year, you watch the ball drop on December 31st. This year, I think we'll be grateful to see 2020 in the rearview mirror, and then you rebalance your portfolio. It also gives momentum, if you will, some time to play out, right? Again, it's arbitrary. That's sort of the downside. There's no sort of rationale that connects it to the market or connects it to exactly how far from your plan each asset allocation is deviated. That's maybe the downside, but the upside is it's objective, it's easy to apply, and I think it's perfectly a valid approach and a good approach. I personally don't follow that approach. I follow the second approach I'm going to share with you. But if you did, personally, I think 1 year is great, and it'll get the job done. I might be on the lookout for extreme market fluctuations like we had this year as a possibility to rebalance. But again, when you do that, that becomes subjective. Well, what's an extreme market event? How much does it have to go down? And if you start to go down that rabbit hole, which is what I do, it becomes probably better to follow the second approach. So what's that? So the first approach is time-based. The second approach is what I call a market-based approach, or some call it opportunistic rebalancing. And here's how it works. You will rebalance an asset class when it deviates from your plan by a certain percentage. Simple as that, right? Now, there are different ways to come up with that. I have a good friend who has this spreadsheet. Each column, I've mentioned this on the show before. His name's Peter. I need to reach out. We haven't had lunch in a while. Good friend. I've known him 30 years. It's one of the smartest guys I know. He's got this spreadsheet, and each column is an asset class, and he gets down to the country level. Like he has money in a China fund. I mean, it's sliced and diced, and he uses the standard deviation of each fund that he has to come up with a formula to trigger rebalancing. So you can get into all of that. I mean, you can get quite sophisticated, I guess. But I take a simpler approach to market-based rebalancing. What I do is I set it at 20%. So in other words, if any asset class deviates by 20%, that will trigger rebalancing. That's the first thing. That's a rebalancing range. I think in JC's question, he used guardrail. I think he means the same thing. I think we're talking about the same thing. So how does that work in practice? So emerging markets, I have 10%. So what's 20% of 10? What's 2? So if my emerging market fund dips below 8% of my total portfolio or above 12, that triggers rebalancing. Now, on the other hand, let's imagine I have U.S. stocks at 40%. Well, now 20% of 40 is 8. So now it's got to dip below 32 or above 48. That's a much bigger, larger range, but it's also a much bigger percentage of my portfolio. And one of the things that range does is allow you to take advantage of momentum, right, before you trigger the rebalancing. Now, you can set a different range. I will tell you that part of my reason for 20% is backtesting. And in fact, one article, and if you Google this, you'll find it. It's called Opportunistic Rebalancing, a New Paradigm for Wealth Managers. I think it's a pretty good article. They do a lot of backtesting. It's fairly technical, but very easy to follow. And their research shows 20% is a sweet spot. Again, I'm not dogmatic about that. Some folks could pick a different number. I like 20% though for another reason. From what I found, it reduces the amount of rebalancing I do. It takes a while for an asset class to get that far out of whack with the other asset classes, right? And so, emerging markets might have a run up, but when it does, usually others do as well, like international funds. And then it could go back down. So I can see my asset classes fluctuating within that 20% range, and I can just leave them be. It's only when they get outside that range that a rebalance is triggered. Now, you can add a time component to this. This doesn't mean you have to check it every single day. And I tend to check it a lot. But it'd be perfectly fine to say, okay, I'm going to use this range, 20% or something else that you pick. But I'm only going to check my actual portfolio to see if it's gone outside of that range every other month or once a quarter. Or maybe once every 6 months. That's fine too. So you can combine these approaches. Now, in addition to rebalancing ranges, you can also think about rebalancing bands, and this is particularly important if part of your rebalancing occurs in taxable accounts. So the idea of a band is this: when you go to rebalance, you have two choices, and we'll use emerging markets as an example. So let's say I've got 10%. It's now 7.5. So it's fallen outside my range. I'm going to rebalance. I can rebalance back to exactly 10%, right down to the penny, 10%, boom. Now, if all my money is in tax-deferred accounts, Roths, traditionals, 401ks, IRAs, that may be a perfectly fine approach because I don't have to worry about taxes when I buy and sell my investments to rebalance. And why not go right back to my original allocation? If you're in taxable accounts to some extent, which I am, then I have to worry about taxes. And so one approach is to say, in addition to a rebalancing range, in our case, we're going to assume 20%, you can have a rebalancing band. And they usually suggest that a band is equal to half your range. So my range is 20%, my band will be 10%. What does that mean? It means that when I rebalance, I don't have to get right back to 10%. I want to just get back to somewhere within my rebalancing band. So again, I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers out at you, but we're using 10% emerging markets. Our rebalancing range is 20%, so that's at 8 to 12%. Our band would be half of that, 9 to 11%. So all I want to do is get my 7.5% at least up to 9, right? And then I can say, okay, I've rebalanced. Now again, if you're rebalancing in tax-deferred accounts, I don't see any reason not to take it to 10. But if rebalancing is going to trigger taxable income, you may not want to go all the way to 10%. So get it within that band. So this is one of those cases where close enough is good enough, right? So it's horseshoes, hand grenades, and rebalancing, I guess, is what I'm telling you. And so there's that idea of rebalancing bands. They actually discussed that in the article I mentioned a minute ago. And that's generally my approach. Now, I will say that I take it even one step further. When it comes to rebalancing, particularly within my bond portfolio, I'm much more concerned, and my bond portfolio, by the way, is a combination of cash, which is not really a bond, but I kind of group them together, cash, TIPS, Treasury inflation-protected securities, TIPS, and then just intermediate term U.S. government bonds. And between those last two, the bonds and the TIPS, it's evenly distributed. Well, when I look at my portfolio now, those have gotten a little out of whack. I don't rush to rebalance those if, one, it's going to trigger taxes, and two, my total bond portfolio is within the range. So in my case, my rebalancing is a little more complicated because of individual stocks. My overall portfolio is 80-20, but that includes individual stocks. If I exclude the individual stocks, which is what I do when I rebalance, I'm looking at, I try to hit a 70-30 portfolio. Well, my total bonds right now are in the upper 20s. So they're not quite at 30. They've come down a little bit because the stocks have gone up, but they're still within the rebalancing range that I have. And so I leave them alone, even though when I look into the sub-asset classes, they're a little off. That's just my own approach. I suppose that may inject some potential subjectivity, but in my case, it's for tax reasons. So anyway, that's the overall approach I take. It's a market-based approach. My rebalancing range is 20%. My rebalancing band is half that, 10%. I tend to check my portfolio more frequently. In my case, I would certainly check it at least every 2 months. I check it more often than that. But if I were actually trying to come up with a plan, I would certainly check it at least every 2 months, or anytime there's sort of a major market swing. I'd look at it and see if they're out of whack. And so those are the approaches. Now, before I leave you today, a couple of thoughts on rebalancing, the actual mechanics of it. If you're rebalancing in retirement accounts, no big deal. There's no tax implications. Buy and sell, do what you need to do. In a taxable account, it gets a little more complicated because you don't want to trigger more taxes than you have to. Now, it's interesting. A lot of studies have found, you want to keep your tax liability to a minimum, but don't let tax liability keep you from doing the right thing on rebalancing. In the long run, the benefits you get from opportunistic rebalancing outweigh the tax consequences. I still hesitate to trigger taxes. So in a taxable portfolio, you want to start with rebalancing by using any new contributions you have to the portfolio, any dividends you've earned in the taxable account because they're taxed anyway, and any interest you earn. So in my taxable account, I do not automatically reinvest dividends. Interest on a bond, and I don't have a lot of bonds in my portfolio, in my taxable account, they get taxed, and your basis for your bond portfolio is going to be pretty close to what you paid for it because you pay the taxes on it as you go. But certainly in the stock funds, I do not automatically reinvest the dividends. It goes to a cash account that I can then use to help rebalance. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and this is something I'm only really appreciating now, there's a concept called asset location, which is where do I put different funds, taxable accounts, retirement accounts, Roth, tax deferred. As a good example of that, REITs should never be in a taxable account, right? Well, there's been sort of this view that bonds should not be in a taxable account either because they pay interest. Interest is treated as ordinary income. It's interesting now, I'm not so sure that's true anymore because bonds aren't paying any interest, right? So I'm getting more on dividend yields than I am interest. Of course, dividends are taxed differently in most cases, but my bonds are paying so little, I kind of wish they were all in taxable accounts at the moment. But here's the point I'm making. When I set up my asset location, I was very focused on tax efficiency. So I put all of my U.S. stock funds in taxable accounts. They're very tax efficient. Yeah, I pay tax on the dividends, generally long-term capital gains, and it's not that much. Well, the problem is now, as you know, the stocks have gone on a tear in the United States. And so now I want to sell some of them to rebalance. Well, I have to trigger taxes. It's my only option. What I would have preferred to do was have at least some of them in a tax deferred account, a retirement account, so that if I ever did need to sell, I could sell them in that account and not trigger the taxes. So the point I'm making is, from an asset location perspective, I kind of like to, at least if I'm going to have anything in a taxable account, have at least some of that same asset class in a retirement account. So in my case, fine, put most of my U.S. stock index funds in my taxable account, but keep some of it in a tax deferred account. It could be the same thing. Emerging markets pay higher yields. So I have those I like to have emerging markets and like small cap and Roth accounts if I can, because long term they're going to do very well. And I want my Roth balance to grow, right? I want it to be, as my mom would say, as fat as a tick. Okay. I'm not sure where that came from, some deep, dark place. In any event, when you're thinking about asset location, yes, taxes matter. That's kind of the big factor when looking at where to put your investments, but also think about future rebalancing. That's something I've learned from experience. It's not the end of the world. I'm actually in the process of selling some of my Vanguard Total Stock Market Fund in my taxable account to rebalance, but I can use some tax losses that I harvested in the spring when we had the market decline to avoid a lot of tax liability on it. And then the rest won't be that bad. So I'm kind of going to bite the bullet. I think I'm going to end up paying about 15 grand in taxes, which I'd rather not pay, but I think long-term the rebalancing is important. But when I go to do the rebalancing, some of my U.S. stock funds will be in tax deferred accounts so that 6 months from now, a year from now, I don't run into this same problem. So JC, thank you for the question. Those are all of my thoughts on rebalancing. I could probably just take the audio here, transcribe it, maybe write a book. I don't know. Maybe I'd have to add a few more things. But to me, that's what you need to know on rebalancing. It's a couple of different approaches you can consider. Also, I talked about the approach I use, not that it's necessarily the best or best for you, but it's what I do. And there you go. If you have any questions, the best place to leave them is in the Facebook group. Again, doorroller.net/Facebook group. And until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.